Welcome to this online webinar, The Broken Umbrella. It's raining in Belgium, won't help, a broken umbrella. This webinar is organized by UCSIA, based in Antwerp, and the Egmont Institute in Brussels. So good morning, USA, good evening, Japan, goedemiddag. My name is Tom Sauer, and I'm a professor in international politics at the University of Antwerp, Belgium. So maybe first some practical announcements. Participants' microphone and camera are switched off by default and cannot be activated. The plenary session will be recorded and the link to watch it again will be sent to you afterwards. You can post written questions for the speakers in the Q&A function during the presentations. And I will read the questions aloud in the Q&A session. In case that there are many questions, it may be that we won't have time to deal with all of them, for which I would like to excuse me in advance. This lecture was supposed to be the opening lecture of the UCSIA Egmont 2-day international workshop, The Broken Umbrella, Shifting Security Architecture in Europe and the Asia Pacific, about US security alliances in Europe and Asia. And that had been scheduled for last December, and that is postponed to October due to COVID. The end of the Cold War did not lead in the immediate post-Cold War period to fundamental changes in the US-centered alliance systems in either Europe or the Asia-Pacific region. Despite concerns about the possible reduction in America's defense commitments in the wake of the disappearance of the shared Soviet threat, throughout the 1990s and until the mid-2000s, European states made minimal efforts to diversify their security dependence on the United States. In the Asia-Pacific region, strategic uncertainties associated with a rising China and the related absence of collective security mechanisms ensured the continuity of the US-led bilateral alliances, also known as the hub-and-spoke security system. Regional fears of possible US disengagement in the post-Cold War era were initially about Washington's political willingness. However, America's relative decline has gradually turned the question into that of US ability to sustain its security commitments, as well as a matter of alliance burden sharing. The perceived Russia threat, especially in the eastern part of Europe, and the perceived China threat, notably in Asia's maritime domain, have raised European and Asian abandonment concerns, respectively, and certainly under Trump. The webinar today will focus on the EU-U.S. relations, also in light of the recent presidential election in the US. A second webinar, with focus on the relation with the Asia-Pacific region, will be scheduled in springtime. We will start this webinar with a lecture by Professor Stefan Brooks, which will be followed by a response by Professor Sven Biscop, and after that there will be time for Q&A. So I'm honored to introduce the first speaker. Professor Stefan Brooks is Professor of Government at Dartmouth, USA. He has previously held fellowships at Harvard and Princeton, and his research examines two topics: US grand strategy and how economic factors influence security affairs. He is the author of many books, amongst which Producing Security, Multinational Corporations, Globalization and the Changing Calculus of Conflict, published by Princeton, World Out of Balance, International Relations and the Challenge of American Primacy, also published by Princeton with William Wolford, and also with Wolford, America Abroad, the United States, Global Role in the 21st Century, published by Oxford University Press in 2016. He has published many articles in journals, such as one in International Security with the title Illusions of Autonomy: Why Europe Cannot Provide for Its Own Security Even if the US Pulls Back. Interesting title. And another one in the same journal titled, shorter, Don't Come Home, America. He received his PhD in political science with distinction from Yale University, where his dissertation received the American Political Science Association's Ellen Dwight Reed Award for the best doctoral dissertation in international relations, law and politics. His lecture today, titled Europe's Role in the US Grand Strategy Debate: Can Strong Transatlantic Security Ties Be Restored?, will examine how Europe fits into the ongoing US grand strategy debate between those who want America to pull back from its overseas security commitments versus those who favor retaining a globally engaged security posture. A key focus will be on identifying why Europe has long been seen by many US analysts as being a less than ideal security partner, and what actions European countries can now take to enhance America's long-term willingness to maintain a strong security presence on the continent. So without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Stephen Brooks. Please.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom, for that very generous introduction, and I really appreciate it. And thanks so much to Sven for convening this project in general and the conference associated with it, and for inviting me to this web seminar. I wish I could be there in person. On the other hand, my understanding is that there are people from all over Europe that are, tuned into this. And so there are advantages to the online platform. There are disadvantages to the online platform. And so in some respects, what Tom and Sven are doing is taking advantage of that, and that there's going to be an in-person part of this discussion, and then there's this online portion of the discussion. Both are useful. So obviously, this is a really, really interesting and important time to talk about transatlantic relations. I'm delighted to be able to give this lecture at the beginning of the Biden presidency, instead of having to give this lecture, as I've done many, many times before, during the Trump presidency, in which oftentimes I would apologize for whatever happened in the previous 2 hours that was offensive to European allies that Trump had said. Biden is obviously very, very, very interested in having a strong, productive relationship with Europe. And so I think this is an ideal time to discuss really what the talk is going to end on is the issue of what agency does Europe have in terms of creating a better, stronger US-European relationship. There will be an outreach from Biden. That's one thing that will affect the strength of the transatlantic relationship. A second thing is how Europe responds. And then finally, there's a third actor in this, which is the Republican Party, in terms of where will it go. And what I would say is Europe does have some role in influencing, what the Republican Party would decide to do. And so what I'm going to emphasize is that there are things that Europe can do to essentially undercut the arguments of those like Trump in the Republican Party, or those outside the Republican Party who argue for the US pulling back. There are things that you can do to make those kind of arguments weaker, which would be good for better transatlantic relations. There are things that you could do which could make those arguments, unfortunately, more compelling, and therefore that would be bad for transatlantic relations. So what I'm going to do is step back from the headlines and use a kind of much more general analysis, focusing on the grand strategy debate that exists here in the United States among scholars, that my co-author, Professor Woolforth, and I examine at length in our recent book that Tom mentioned called America Abroad. And the initial kind of basis for that argument was outlined in the international security article that he mentioned called Don't Come Home, America. The title of that international security article obviously gives you a sense of where I'm coming from, and that I don't want the US to pull back from its security alliances. I don't want the US to pull back from NATO. And I just stress this point at the outset of the lecture because I will say some things, especially at the end of the talk, that may seem like I don't think this is the case, that may seem like I'm critical or doubtful or skeptical of the value of the US role in NATO. And the reason I may sometimes seem like I'm saying things like that, is because I'm going to be discussing the US grand strategy debate, and the terms for this debate were set by those who want the US to pull back. They were the first ones who initiated this debate. The people like Barry Posen or John Mearsheimer or Stephen Walt or Bob Pape, the people who want to pull back from the world, were the first ones to kind of initiate the US grand strategy debate. And then people like me and Woolforth responded to it, but we responded to it on the terms that they set. All right, so the outline for my talk is going to have 4 parts. The first part, I'm just going to say a few brief words about the US global power position. The second part of the talk will then describe various positions in the US scholarly debate over US grand strategy. The third part of the talk, I'm going to outline in briefest terms the essence of why I think it makes sense for the US to strongly maintain its security ties to security alliances like NATO. And then finally, the end of my talk will sketch 5 reasons why so many scholars in the United States now want the US to pull back from its security alliances, most especially from NATO. And what I'm going to use is that 5-part critique as a basis for developing a series of recommendations for what Europeans can do now to help sustain a stronger security partnership with the United States for the long term. So those are the 4 parts of my talk. Part 1 is the US power position. The big question that the US grand strategy debate examines is whether it still makes sense for the US to pursue a globally engaged security policy. Of course, there are many people who say that the US is declining so much that it won't even be able to pursue a globally engaged grand strategy, that it won't be able to sustain its current security commitments. I think that argument is totally wrong, at least for, say, the next 3 decades or so, which is a long time. I'm not going to describe why I think that in this particular talk, but I have 2 chapters in the book with Woolforth, which backs up my conclusion that I'd be happy to go into in the question and answer period. In essence, the overall conclusion that Woolforth and I have in these 2 chapters is that the US retains the choice to pursue a globally engaged grand strategy for at least the next 3 decades. In fact, I would say something stronger, which is that no other country besides the United States, or no other entity besides the United States, has this choice before it. So for the foreseeable future, 3 decades or so, either the US will lead or no one will. And we reach this conclusion on the basis of a very careful measure of the distribution of power and how it's changed. So first part of the talk is stressing that the US retains the choice to pursue a globally engaged grand strategy. The question that scholars in this debate are now asking is, should it? Just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. And in the book, our answer to this question, as I've already intimated, is that the US should continue to have a globally engaged grand strategy. All right, so that's the first part of the talk. Second part is going to be looking at the various positions in the US grand strategy debate. There are lots of different terms, lots of different labels that are used in the US grand strategy debate. I'm going to simplify things by saying that really there are only 3 positions that matter. All the others you can just kind of forget about. The 3 positions are deep engagement. That's the position that Woolforth and I are associated with. Then the second position is what's called offshore balancing. And the most famous proponents of that are Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer. And the third position is restraint. And the leader of the restraint camp The person who's written the most on it recently is Barry Posen. Okay, so let me just begin by outlining what the deep engagement grand strategy is, because it's often misinterpreted, especially by people who want the US to pull back. Proponents of the US pulling back often misinterpret the US grand strategy because they don't focus on its core defining elements, the parts of the grand strategy that never changed for 70 years and were never challenged for 70 years until Trump. So what are these kind of core underlying objectives that lie at the base of deep engagement? The first one is promoting enough stability in 3 core regions: Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East. To be clear, not perfect stability, enough stability for the United States to secure its overall foreign policy objectives. So that's the first objective. The second objective is promoting a liberal economic order to expand the global economy and maximize US prosperity. The third and final element, core element of the deep engagement grand strategy, is sustaining and revising the global institutional order to secure necessary interstate cooperation that benefits the United States. So the pursuit of these 3 core objectives lie at the core of what is arguably the United States' most consequential strategic choice, which is to maintain permanent security commitments to partners and allies in Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East. So here's a really important point to stress, and that is that the core of deep engagement is defensive. The core of deep engagement is about protecting allies. It's about protecting globalization. It's about protecting the institutional order. It is, in other words, focused on preserving certain elements of the status quo that are favorable to the United States and to its allies. And the key point, again, is that before Trump, all US presidents, all of them, Republican and Democrat, saw these 3 core objectives as crucial and did not question them. So that's what deep engagement is. What are the alternatives to it that are outlined in the US grand strategy debate? There are 2 alternatives. The first general alternative is to do more, to take those 3 core objectives that I just mentioned and add on additional things on top of it. What are those additional things? Those additional things could be democracy promotion. Those additional things could be advancing human rights. Those additional things could be trying to promote stability in other regions besides the 3 that I just mentioned. Well, there are lots and lots of people in Washington, D.C. who favor this kind of approach. And what Wolf Wars do as a label for this approach, we call it deep engagement plus. Because the point is, it wants to do the 3 things that deep engagement does, plus other things. Lots of people in DC favor this approach. On the left, they're called liberal interventionists, and on the right, they're called neoconservatives. But significantly, within the US grand strategy debate, there are essentially no scholars, 0, who advance this deep engagement plus perspective. It's really just not part of the debate. There were some people like Steve Rosen and a few others who in the early Bush presidency were kind of advancing this kind of perspective, but they quickly stopped writing on this. And there's really no one that I can think of who right now is a scholarly proponent of deep engagement plus. So one alternative to deep engagement is to do more. The other alternative to deep engagement is to do less and to disengage by pulling back. There are 2 versions of pulling back. There's the restraint version. That's, as I noted, Barry Posen, the most prominent proponent, but other people would be like Eugene Goltz, Daryl Press. And the restraint perspective wants to cut all US alliances, all of them. In Europe, get rid of NATO, get rid of the alliance with Japan, get rid of the alliance with Korea, get rid of the alliance with Australia, cut all permanent long-term security partnerships in the Middle East, all of them, all gone. That's what restraint wants. Offshore balancing, on the other hand, and there Walt and Mearsheimer are the key proponents, they want to cut some alliances, but keep others. And in a nutshell, what they want is to maintain US security alliances in Asia, but cut them everywhere else. And here's what's fascinating, and I really want you to kind of understand and process this point, which is that Waltz and Mearsheimer and Posen are disagreeing on a fair number of things, but there's one thing they really strongly agree with, and that is that the one place the US definitely should pull out of is from Europe. Both of these camps overlap in saying that the security rationale for pulling out of NATO is kind of overwhelmingly obvious. So, among scholars who want the US to pull back, what I'm saying is NATO is their number one target. And let me just stress also that within the US grand strategy debate, that the pullback position, those people who are arguing either for restraint or offshore balancing, that's the dominant perspective in terms of the number of people, at least. There's only around 40 scholars, I would say, who are writing on US grand strategy today and issuing some kind of normative recommendation of what it should do. Out of those 40 scholars, 35 of them want the US to pull back. There are lots and lots of other people besides Posen, Walt, Mearsheimer, Pate, Goltz, Press that want to pull back. There are not many, roughly around 5, who, like me, want the US to stay engaged. There's me, that's 1. Wolfworth, my co-author, that's 2. And the other 3 that I can note for you would be Joe Nye at Harvard, John Eikenberry, who we co-authored with 7 years ago at Princeton, and Bob Art at Brandeis. So what I do in the book with Wolfworth is we respond to these arguments from these 35 scholars who are saying they want the US to pull back. Okay, so that's the end of the second part of my talk, which is what is the US grand strategy debate and what are the positions within it? Third part, which is even shorter, looks at the question of, well, why should the US stay engaged in the world? Why do Wolfworth and I think, yes, maintaining NATO and maintaining US security alliances, that's the best thing to do? I can't go through the book in detail by any means. It takes, 200 pages for us to make the argument. But I'm just gonna, like 3 minutes, make 3 key points. The first key point is that we argue that deep engagement is beneficial because it fosters a more favorable security environment for the United States. Deep engagement simultaneously helps to reassure allies and deter adversaries. Moreover, deep engagement gives the US leverage over its allies to prevent them from engaging in provocative actions or transferring military arms to potential adversaries. So in a single sentence, our overall punchline is that security in these 3 core regions is higher. There's more security in these regions when the US is there providing security from the outside, rather than if the local actors were just trying to provide for security themselves. So that's the first reason we think the US should stay engaged. It fosters a better security environment in these 3 regions. The second key argument that we make is that those 35 scholars who say they want the US to pull back, they're missing many of the benefits of deep engagement. The analysis of grand strategy cannot be limited just to security affairs. But that's exactly what virtually all scholars like Posen and Walt Mearsheimer do. They focus just on security and that's it. They don't look at economic issues. They don't look at issues of institutionalized cooperation. But that's a real problem because obviously deep engagement encompasses institutional goals. And the US clearly does get benefit in terms of enhanced cooperation. And of course, economic globalization is a key part of deep engagement as well, promoting a stable global economy. So if you ignore these economic and cooperation institutional benefits of deep engagement, if you just don't even focus on them, you just look at, is deep engagement good for US security? You miss a lot of what deep engagement is trying to do, and therefore have a biased evaluation of whether it's good or bad for the United States to continue. The third and final key point that we make in the book for why the US should stay engaged is that in our view, the costs and risks of deep engagement can be managed. Those 35 scholars who want the US to pull back, they've advanced a powerful set of arguments for why deep engagement is costly and why it is risky. They're good arguments. I mean, I can't say none of them have any validity. It took us a whole book to address those arguments. But what I would stress is that those arguments are not airtight. And especially, and this is what I want you guys to really hear, those arguments become weaker, less strong, when the US gets appropriate help from its allies. When the US gets appropriate help from its allies, then the costs and risks of deep engagement go down and can be reduced to a manageable level. All right, so now I've set up the final part of the talk, which is what are these costs and risks of deep engagement? And how can Europe best help the US to reduce them to as low a level as possible? All right, so that's part 4, the final part of my talk. And what I'm going to do there is outline the 5 critiques that these 35 scholars make, the 5 reasons they say, yes, the US should pull back, and then say, okay, in light of that argument, in light of that critique, what does that imply that Europe should do to make that kind of argument less strong? So what are these 5 critiques that these 35 scholars make? And when I outline these 5 critiques, you'll be like, huh, that sounds a little bit familiar, because a lot of them overlap with things that Trump said. But of course, these scholars are saying it in a more convincing and more diplomatic way than he did. So what are these 5 arguments? The first one is entrapment. And what entrapment says is, if we pursue deep engagement, then it might be that our allies will pull us into wars that are not in our interest. That's the first argument they make for why deep engagement doesn't make sense. The second argument is free riding. If we defend our allies, then they will spend less. The third argument is budgetary cost. These 35 scholars argue we could cut defense by a lot, save a lot of money, and use that for things at home if we didn't have these security alliances. The fourth argument is what you could call lacking cooperation. And here the point is that these 35 scholars say the US doesn't get any extra benefit in terms of enhanced cooperation because it's providing for the security of these 3 regions. You know, it gets cooperation from them, but only when it's in the interest of our allies to provide that cooperation. The US doesn't kind of get extra benefits in terms of extra cooperation due to its security presence. And then the fourth and final argument is what Wilforth and I call the temptation argument. And what the temptation argument says is essentially, if the US has a big military, and if the US has it based everywhere and has alliances all over the place, then it's going to be more tempted to get involved in security issues that we best to essentially leave aside. So this is the kind of problem that if you have a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. So in other words, if the US can engage in new missions to advance values or protect democracy or promote stability in some other region, which really isn't that important, it'll be more likely to do those kinds of extra things. It'll be more likely, in other words, to engage in deep engagement plus type stuff if it has this global security presence. And so what they argue is the US should essentially tie its hands, come home, cut its military, not have overseas bases, and then it'll just be less tempted to do that kind of stuff. So those are the 5 arguments that they make. What do those 5 arguments then imply in terms of what Europe should do to make them weaker? That's the end of the talk. Before getting into these 5 recommendations, what I would say is that Tom mentioned that my co-author, Hugo Mayer at Sciences Po, and I have an article forthcoming in International Security, and the next issue actually of International Security, which is examining the prospects for European strategic autonomy in the defense security realm. And in a nutshell, we say strategic autonomy is simply not feasible in the short and medium term, at least. So as a background, therefore, the perspective that I'm coming from is to say, although I totally understand why Europe would want to be strategically autonomous in the defense and security realm, I don't think that's a viable option. And it's therefore, at least in the short and medium term, the best option, really the only option, is to make sure that you have a strong security partnership with the United States. So, happy to discuss that article and some of the things we say in the Q&A, but that's just as a background point. Okay, so now I'm going to run through those 5 arguments and say, what do they mean for what Europe should now do? Temptation problem. In my view, that's probably the biggest weakness or biggest problem with deep engagement. Like the thing that I have the hardest saying, oh, don't worry about that. And what I would say is that Europe should help reduce the temptation problem by helping the US avoid unnecessary quagmires in peripheral places. And you might be like, yeah, sure, why wouldn't we do that? And here what I would say is that Europe in the past, the recent past, has unfortunately sometimes had the opposite effect. And here what I'm really thinking about in my head is Libya, where Obama wanted to stay out. I've talked to his advisors, his very close advisors, and he did not want to do Libya. Why did he do that? Well, the most important reason, these advisors tell me, is lobbying by Europeans for the US to do that. That you guys, especially the French and British, called, the White House over and over and over and over and over, day after day after day after day, saying, we want you to do Libya, we want you to do Libya. We can't do it by ourselves. Can you just do the first part where you're identifying targets and taking out anti-aircraft capacity and using drones and other things to take out the Libyan military? If you can do that, then we can do the rest, but we really, really need you to do that. So that was, in my view, a dumb mission. That was an example of deep engagement plus. That's an example of the kind of thing that the US should not be doing. That's an example of the kind of thing that if the US does too much of, then the American people, in my view, are eventually going to say, I don't want to do deep engagement. It's crucial for the United States to restrict itself, in my view, to the 3 core objectives and to not be doing deep engagement plus. If it does too much deep engagement plus, if it does too many Libya type operations, which don't go well, that's going to be really bad for deep engagement. So vitally important for the Europeans to basically help the US shy away from deep engagement plus. And the way you can do that is don't lobby in the future for the US to do things like Libya. Don't do that. It's not helpful. And so as a general rule, what I would say is that Europeans should essentially back off in terms of pressuring the US on right to protect kind of stuff. I get it. I would like to do those missions too, but don't pressure the US to do that kind of stuff. It's not in your interest. So that's the first recommendation that I have. The second recommendation flows out of the entrapment argument. And here what I would say is that there are things that Europe can and should now be doing, especially on the conventional military front, to reduce the risk of entrapment, to increase Europeans' defensive deterrence vis-a-vis Russia, and to do that in a way which complements rather than competes with US strengths. So I can go through what that means in more detail in the Q&A, but basically what I'm saying is there are things that you need to do that the US really can't, and you need to focus on those things. We're not going to invest in hundreds or thousands of more main battle tanks and put them in Europe. You need to do that. On the other hand, there are things that you might think about doing to be able to balance Russia that I think would be counterproductive, in that to really balance Russia, you would need to develop a very sophisticated C4ISR capacity. Well, doing that is going to take you a really long time and take a ton of money, and all it will do is duplicate what the US has. That's not a good investment that you should make. So focus on the things like tanks that is needed for conventional deterrence that you only can provide. That will reduce the entrapment risk and make it easier for the US to stay engaged in Asia. Third point, free riding. Trump reified 2% of GDP as the standard that's used to judge allies. But obviously, other things matter. And Europe now has a chance to work jointly with the Biden administration to come up with a more appropriate, more comprehensive set of benchmarks. In my view, Europe can reduce the perception of free riding by being active instead of passive in terms of defining the standard of what a good ally is. Don't let the US define that standard. Define that standard for yourself. Think of the things that you could do in the next 4 years that the US would notice and appreciate. And I have some ideas on this front that I'll very briefly discuss in the final words of my talk that flow from my research with Hugo that I can perhaps discuss more in the question and answer period. Fourth argument that these 35 scholars make is the budgetary cost. And what I would say is, if Europe does the three things I just mentioned, help the US shy away from the temptation problem, reduce the entrapment risk, do things to reduce the level of free riding, then it's possible the US might be able to reduce its spending on defense somewhat, at least in the portion of US defense spending that gets directed at Europe. Finally, these 35 scholars say, US doesn't get any extra cooperation from its security presence. So, that's the reason that pursuing deep engagement doesn't really make sense. Well, I've already mentioned some things that I think should be done now to change how Americans think about Europe on this front. In addition to what I've already said, let me just make two more points. First, I think Europe should do a better job of reminding the United States of the things that the Europeans do as good allies that are taken for granted and not noticed. As an example, European countries are extremely supportive of the United States and the International Monetary Fund. Well, in some respects, you're so supportive and have been so supportive for so long that Americans have perhaps forgotten about this. Well, you should remind them. The second thing I would say is I would flip the script and emphasize not the relative level of help that Europe gives the United States, but emphasize more the absolute level of help. And here what I have in my mind is we had about 8 years ago, Jim Mattis was based at Dartmouth for about a month. He's an amazing guy, learned a ton from him. And I remember he was in a seminar and he emphasized this point that really was very pointed and really stuck in my head. And what he said is, with respect to NATO's help in Afghanistan, he was basically like, do I wish the Europeans could do more? I sure do. Does it frustrate me that they're not doing more? Definitely. But would I rather have 40,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan or zero? And he's like, definitely would prefer 40,000. So that's an example of kind of emphasizing the absolute level of help that I think would be useful to do. So my conclusion to the talk is just to say that I think it's reasonable now for Europeans to think carefully about what they can do to tilt the term of the debate over US grand strategy in favor of those people like me who want to make the case for America staying in Europe. And I know that there are lots of people, key people in the Biden administration who are really familiar with this debate and will be responsive to arguments from Europeans that address the fundamentals of what this debate is about. I definitely know this with respect to Jake Sullivan because he was based at Dartmouth for 2 years. And when he showed up, he was very frustrated. He's like, I don't find a lot of arguments from academics about why the US should stay engaged. And I said, hold on a second, read this book, and I gave him our book. And then a couple weeks later, he's like, gosh, every argument you could possibly make, you guys made. This is great. This is so useful for me. So he wants to kind of tilt the grand strategy debate in a direction which makes it easier for the US to stay engaged. And you guys need to do things essentially to help him. How can you do that? Well, I've gone through a bunch of those arguments. The only other thing that I would say is that on the specific kind of military investment front, that I would be thinking in terms of what are things that Europe can do in the short term, which would to some degree vitiate one of those arguments that I just mentioned about entrapment, about free riding, and examples of things like that that you could potentially do in the short term. Military mobility, that'd be really valuable for you guys to focus on more. Special operations forces, the US would really appreciate it if you had more capacity there. And if you had more capacity there, that would be helpful in terms of conventional deterrence vis-a-vis Russia. Cyber capacity, that's something that the US would really benefit from and really value, and where you guys could have a lot to contribute. And then institutionally, you know, a small thing that Hugo and I identified is that you might think about revising the Stability and Growth Pact to exclude defense investments. You know, defense investments take a long time. They're clearly needed. Who could argue that that's not necessary? Who would not want to be increasing defense right now under the Biden administration to be able to say, hey, look, you want us to be good allies? We are good allies. Well, you're constrained in some respects by doing that because of the Stability and Growth Pact, but you could exclude defense investment from it, at least temporarily. Okay, so I've thrown a lot of stuff at your way. Looks like I've gone just a few minutes over my my time, but I'm getting a thumbs up from Tom, and very happy to answer your questions, and also very interested to hear from Sven. So I will stop talking now and now switch to listening.
Thanks a lot, Professor Brooks, Stefan, for this clear presentation, structured presentation of your views on the EU-US relationship. The response comes from Professor Sven Biscop, who may have a slightly different view, certainly a different perspective, being a European. Professor Biscop is the director of the Europe in the World program at the Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels, which he joined in 2002. And Sven is also professor at the Ghent Institute for International Studies at Ghent University, and his research and teaching focuses on the strategies of the European Union, NATO, and their member states. Before I give Sven the floor, I just would like to remind the audience that you can put questions, not in the chat box, but in the Q&A function. Please do so while Sven gives his presentation. Sven, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Stephen. That was really interesting, and I'm really very glad that we can at least have this exchange on this very substantial exchange online, and I look forward to doing it in person as soon as possible. Let me maybe start by saying that of course Europe needs strategic autonomy. That goes without saying. And that I would say, in fact, that a lot of the arguments that you've made, or a lot of the advice that you gave for what Europe should do, that for me amounts precisely to strategic autonomy. So maybe part of this discussion is semantics, but I do think it's a little bit more than that. I think no one doubts that the EU has strategic autonomy as an economic actor. It's one of the top 3 economies in the world, and we do what we want. Simplifying. We are an autonomous actor in political terms, though seldom a very effective one, because usually we're too divided. And of course in security and defense sphere, it is limited, our actorness. But I would say we have no choice but to go for strategic autonomy, which I simply define as having the capacity to always defend your vital interests, preferably with allies and partners, but if necessary, alone. And I do say vital interests, so not everything that you may decide you want to care about, but what is vital, you need, if necessary, to be able to defend that alone. If necessary, even without the United States, or temporarily without the United States. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. One reason is new. it's Trump. And Trump, luckily, if I may say that, lost the election. But Trumpism is not that. I mean, I'm not sure that his thinking merits an ism. Maybe it's more Trumpiness, because I will not call it a system. But clearly, this has shown us that we cannot be sure in the medium term, even of the strategic orientation of the United States, and we better prepare for someone who thinks very much like Trump, for the chance of such a person being elected into the presidency. And we have to prepare for that. The other reason goes back to the Obama administration, and you talked about a lot, Stephen, the strong focus on Asia. There are two sides to that. One, I think it's not a given yet that we entirely agree about how to deal with the rise of China. I do hope that we can find an agreement now with the Biden administration, but it is not given because the threat perception is different. The conversation in Europe about China is changing. There is more skepticism than there was, but at the same time, there are few people here who think that the fact in itself that China is a great power is a problem, which I do think is part of the debate in the US. So we'll see how that evolves. But the simple fact of the matter is that because of the focus on China, Europe has in a way become a secondary theater for the US. Still very important, but secondary. So what happens if you have two crises simultaneously, one in Asia, one in Europe? It may be that US reinforcements will still come, but perhaps somewhat later and in smaller numbers than we had anticipated. So we need to prepare for that. So strategic autonomy for me is not strategic autonomy without US or strategic autonomy against the US. Strategic autonomy is sort of the core of who you are, and it's as a strategically autonomous player that we ought to rebalance our alliance with the US. Now, in concrete terms, what could that mean? We have a very interesting opportunity now because the EU and NATO both are drafting strategic papers. The EU is drafting what it has somewhat oddly called a strategic compass for European defense, and NATO will soon decide that it will draft a new strategic concept. Both documents have to be finished in 2022. Now, what will probably happen is that we will have two totally separate processes, totally stovepiped, and so Europeans will say one thing in the EU process and another thing in the NATO process. What we should do, if we're smart, is to take part in the NATO process as EU and to take a collective stance as EU and to somehow make a package deal, to finally end this bickering about who does what and make a package deal. And I see three dimensions to that link to your recommendations, Stephen. One, make it very clear that collective territorial defense, we will continue to organize that in the NATO framework. There is a legal obligation within the EU treaty that says that an attack on one EU member state is an attack on all, but we will not have EU force planning and EU command structure for territorial defense. We will continue to do that through NATO. What I think the EU could do in this sphere is to look at all kinds of threats that fall below that threshold. And I think Article 42.7 of the treaty could be used, for all the hybrid or the homeland security issues. And we could say as EU that a cyber attack on one EU member state is a cyber attack on all, and find a collective way of dealing with that. Or economic blackmailing of one EU member state is economic blackmailing of all. And that is, I think, how the EU Mutual Defense Guarantee could very usefully complement NATO. It's also something that basically NATO cannot do because this is about geoeconomics, how do you use the single market, and so on and so forth. To a large extent, this is just EU competence. But the military collective defense we continue to do through NATO. However, the Europeans, I think, have to know that we have to beef up the conventional first line of defense. I'm not talking nuclear deterrence, but conventional deterrence. We need more conventional firepower. The first line of defense, conventional line of defense and deterrence is already European. There are some American combat troops, again, of course, in the Baltics and in Poland, but basically the first line is European. And I think, to put it simply, we must be able to say to the Russians, even without any American present in Europe, you would not be able to win a short and sharp conventional war against the Europeans. The Europeans, in conventional terms, will be able to stop you and to grind you to a halt by themselves. And then when the American reinforcements come, we'll kick you out. That will demand an investment in the tanks, in missiles, in artillery, in the classic hardware, if you want. Secondly, I do think that then vice versa, the EU should say, we will take charge of security on the southern flank. That demands a very integrated political, economic, and security approach. I agree with you entirely. It ought not to be the US business to deal with Libya. It's not the problem of the United States. It's our problem and we ought to solve it. So I would say NATO, military collective defense. The EU does expeditionary on the southern flank. There is no need to be involved there under two flags. And since it's mostly our problem, let us deal with it. Then the third part of that is, how do you get the capabilities for all of that? We have now two defense planning processes, one in NATO and one in the EU. Neither works very well, though the EU one performs much worse than the NATO one. The NATO defense planning process sets targets, binding targets for all individual allies. But in many capability areas, the European allies individually will never ever meet those targets because they don't have the scale anymore. The EU process sets collective targets, but they're not binding. So we have an extremely intricate process on the EU side that everybody ignores. Not a single defense planner in Europe cares what the EU defense planning process says. What we need to do is somehow to merge them. And so the way I see this is that the Europeans would say, look, of the NATO capability targets, by year X, the Europeans collectively will meet 50% of that. And we're going to do that by using the EU instruments that we have, permanent structured cooperation and the European Defence Fund. For example, today NATO wants to be able to deploy 2 corps on expeditionary operations. Well, one of those 2 corps should be a European corps. But this means that we really ought to use the EU defense instruments to the maximum, which we're not doing now. We're making marginal use of the instruments because we're going for interoperability and a bit of cooperation. What we ought to do, like in so many other areas of European politics, is real integration, and that requires a change of mindset. So I think this sort of package deal, I know politically it's easy for me to say it, very difficult to get it done. But this is how I could see the eternal EU-NATO debate settled. Finally, to conclude, the 2 key actors here are the United States and the European Union, right? Who can do a grand strategy? Of course, United States. On the European side, grand strategy with a global impact, potentially only the EU can do it. Not a single individual European state can be a global strategic actor in all dimensions of power. I mean, some are dreaming of it. The term global Britain comes to mind as an illusion, a beautiful illusion maybe, but an illusion. So only the EU has the potential to do grand strategy. So my number one advice to the Biden team would be, speak to the EU. Your access point into working with the Europeans is the EU. It is not NATO. NATO is a tiny bit of that. If you want to talk about China, how are we positioning ourselves these days, the great powers vis-a-vis each other? It's geoeconomics. NATO doesn't have a single market. NATO doesn't have a trade policy. NATO doesn't have an energy policy. If you want to agree, to align, to coordinate, you have to talk with the European Union. And I know there is a very strong push now from the US side to put China on the agenda of NATO. And I think what you're seeing here, in my view, is a confusion between NATO as an alliance of member states and NATO, the apparatus, the NATO bureaucracy, if you want. Of course, NATO allies have to talk and consult each other and coordinate about everything that is relevant for security. It does not follow, however, that on all of these topics, you then need to open a new branch in NATO headquarters and develop a NATO policy on it. Because on many of those topics, you will find that NATO doesn't have the tools, and the tools will be EU tools. So yes, we can talk about China, we can talk about climate change, we can talk about energy. I just don't think that NATO machinery should then, open yet another division to deal with that. We should bring on board the EU, and we should really have a very sound and thorough direct EU-U.S. strategic dialogue. Those are the two players at the level of grand strategy, if you want. So, to NATO, I would say the organization is not the alliance. That is just a bit of it. Voila. I rest my case there, and I look forward to your responses, Stephen, and to the debate. But that was a really interesting presentation. I look very much forward to reading your upcoming article in international security. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven. I'm sure that Stefan wants to reply, but I propose that I will read some questions from the audience, and that Stefan can always come back to what Sven has said. The first question that came in fact, there were two questions by Theo, but the second one has been answered, I believe, by Stefan. The second question was, will the Biden administration return to war and invasion? I think that Stefan has argued that we Europeans should help the Biden administration not doing so. But his first question is maybe more to the point, and he questions whether the word security should not be replaced by supremacy. Stefan, is it not all about US supremacy instead of US security?
I don't think so. In that, one thing it's important to distinguish between is there's the deep engagement strategy that I'm arguing for. There's the pursuit of these three core goals. Like, that is what I think the US should focus on. Is that what the US has always only focused on? No. I mean, a lot of the post-Cold War period is the US engaging in deep engagement plus. So I'm not arguing for a continuation of the US grand strategy as it has been practiced. It's been practiced in a way which I think you could perhaps use the term supremacy as a descriptor. But I'm saying that's a mistake. If you look at, for example, the US policy in the Middle East, look at US policy in the Middle East before 9/11. How much did the US use force in the Middle East before 9/11? Almost never. How many troops did the US have in the Middle East before 9/11? Very few. The only time before the first Persian Gulf War, before the first Persian Gulf War, the United States, in some circumstances was often, telling Europeans, like, don't be as active there. So, the US to do what I wanted to do, as I said, it's a defensive mission. It doesn't involve changing the existing status quo. It doesn't need to make Europe or Middle East into democracies. It doesn't need to transform, China in any particular way. It doesn't need the ability to engage in military coercion against China or against Russia. It just needs to make sure that they can't engage in military coercion against either it or US allies. So what I'm saying is the US should adopt a very defensive approach to its grand strategy. And I don't see how you could say a defensive approach to US grand strategy, which is focusing on, let's protect our allies, let's protect globalization, let's protect the institutional order. That doesn't sound like supremacy to me, because it seems like basically the US is trying to, from that vantage point, to preserve the status quo. And my guess is that conception of the status quo, those elements of it, that Europeans, Japanese, Koreans probably agree with like 99%. So it would only be supremacy if the US was saying, I want to change the world in this way. and it's different than what you want. I'm not arguing for that, and so remember, this is a scholarly debate about grand strategy. Posen and Mearsheimer are making the argument for a hypothetical grand strategy that's never been practiced. They're saying, we haven't been doing restraint or we haven't been doing offshore balancing. I want us to do that instead. My position is actually not that much different. And then what I'm saying is, we've been doing deep engagement plus for a long time, and it makes no sense. Let's do deep engagement. I'm also arguing for a hypothetical grand strategy, but that hypothetical grand strategy is grounded in the commonality of US grand strategies that existed for 70 years. I'm saying go back to the fundamentals, and those fundamentals are defensive. And if they're defensive, I don't think you can say supremacy.
Okay, thanks, Stefan. I have another question for you about strategic autonomy of Europe. And the question is posed by John Helferich, and he asks, has the US perception of EU strategic autonomy aspirations, has it changed? Has there been an evolution of the US perception of that concept from 2000 until now? You mentioned that strategic autonomy is still not feasible, not in the short term or medium term, but do you also perceive that there's more willingness in Europe to create such a strategic autonomy?
I definitely perceive more willingness to do it. And, returning to what Sven said is, I think it's very possible to see a lot of what could be done to make Europe strategically autonomous as being compatible with, strengthening the transatlantic relationship and strengthening Europe. I totally agree with that. And so therefore, again, if you're thinking about like a Venn diagram, I really say it's important to be thinking in terms of like, okay, to be strategically autonomous in the defense realm, like there's a long list of things that Europe has to do. And, some of those things, a lot of those things can easily be said that this is going to make us more independent, but it's also going to make us a better ally. So whether you, the United States, stay or go, whether you're busy fighting in Asia or not, like these things are going to be helpful for us in terms of making us more independent. But if you are here, if you are in NATO and if you are fighting here, you'd like those things also. So I would really focus on doing things that the US would be like, oh, great, I'm really glad that you're doing that. I know you have a limited set of resources, and now I've seen that you invested in 500 more main battle tanks. That's really useful. Now I've seen that you've really increased your military mobility. That makes you more independent, also makes you a good ally. Those are the golden things that I think should be focused on. And what I would say is shy away from the things which would be necessary to be fully strategically autonomous, which are things that are either not feasible in the short term, or the only reason you would be doing those things would be to actually be fully independent of the United States. And C4ISR is, I think, the biggest example there. I mean, like, to be fully autonomous in defense, you would need that. I mean, the reason that you asked the United States for help in Libya is because you couldn't identify targets and destroy things with precision. And that was against Libya. I mean, Libya is no Russia. If you can't do that against Libya, there's no way that you're ready to do that against Russia. So you would need all of the satellites, all of the sensors, all the AWACS, all that kind of stuff to be able to identify targets in real time, to be able to distribute that information to planners, to be able to come up with some sort of plan in real time to then distribute it back to all the military forces. The US is the only country in the world that can do that. And it's taken us many decades to figure that out, and hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. I don't think it makes sense for Europe to develop that kind of capacity because the US has that. And for you guys to duplicate it would be difficult, take a long time. Not sure if you could do it. The amount of training that would be necessary to do that would be incredible. The US is only, gained a lot of that experience, unfortunately, by fighting a lot of wars. And then there's the issue of like interoperability. Like it's hard for the U.S. to do that, but we speak all the same language. We're controlled all by the same military. It's gonna be very difficult for you to coordinate that kind of stuff. So you would only do that if you really wanted to be acting independently of the United States. And from the U.S. perspective, to invest in those things, I'd be like, fine, like invest in those things, but only if you first bought all of the, tanks and APCs and artillery that you need to actually defend yourself against Russia. As long as you've done the things that you need on the front lines to defend yourself, if you've checked all those boxes, then sure, go ahead and build C4SR. But if you haven't, then to pursue that kind of objective would, in my view, seem foolish.
Okay, I'm sure that Sven wants to react.
Thanks.
Which I said, of course, in a very diplomatic, unnuanced American type way. But, I lecture often to Dartmouth undergrads. We only have undergraduates here at Dartmouth. And so my tendency, is to express myself verbally in very strong, super clear terms. But of course, in my mind, I'm thinking about, counter argument this, condition that, but it's kind of more fun sometimes to say it in a super strong way. So there you go.
Thanks. And in that spirit, I will heartily disagree with you. In a way, I think you've epitomized the eternal American dilemma. You want the Europeans to do more, you want us to take care of Libya, but you want to control it at the same time. And I would say that's just not how politics works. If you want us to do it, you will have to let us decide. If you're saying you can do it, but the C4ISR will be American, that basically means you maintain your control over it. And we will then have to ask you to come into Libya and so on. So there I frankly see an inconsistency in your argument. I think the Europeans do need their own capacity in that area, at the very least at the level, so that they can do, if necessary, expeditionary operations by themselves on our southern flank. And that's also, honestly, a question of defense industrial autonomy and technological autonomy. I've had many debates here with, people from the State Department who massively overestimate my influence and come to my office to convince me that we should buy American. And it's always the same. I say, yeah, but America already produces this though, so why would you do the same? And then I say, yeah, well, I'm sure Americans also make really good washing machines and microwaves. We also don't stop producing those in Europe, right? So I think one has to take into account the technological and industrial dimension, but mostly, if you say you can't have your own C4ISR, then you're basically saying we will maintain a veto right over everything that you want to do. And I think in political terms, that is just not workable.
Yeah. So my vantage point is, I don't know if you see this, but this is my first book, Producing Security. And the most important part of it was looking at how are weapon systems made. And the important point, that I noticed looking at the Soviet-U.S. competition and the overall trajectory of military systems is that, military systems, developing individual systems, and then developing the information architecture for using them, and then figuring out the ability to get all those systems to work together, it's so complicated now. So like, if this was 1950, if we had the kind of military technology that existed then, where you could, be like, oh, I don't have this fighter, or I don't have this, this kind of, sensor. I'll build it and I'll have it 3 years from now. And you didn't need to have an information architecture to see where everything was and distribute that information in real time. I think Europe could be strategically autonomous in the military realm in like 5 years if you tried. But it's not in 1950. And the point is to develop your own independent C4SR, which would be capable of dealing with the Russian threat. I don't know how long that would take you, but I'm thinking decades, not years. And I'm thinking not like, 10 billion here, 20 billion here, but like hundreds of billions of dollars to do that. But like your point that like, can you guys develop that kind of capacity to deal with Libya? I think you can, I think you should. I think that would be great. I would love that you could develop your own C4SR. I would love that you could do it. I'm not against it. I just see it as impossible. If it was possible, I'd say do it. If it was possible for you guys to defend yourself against Russia, I would love for you to be able to do it. I don't want to be there. I don't want to be entrapped. I don't like spending a lot of money on defense. I understand all these arguments that Posen and Walton Mearsheimer are making, but I'm coming at it from the vantage point saying, and here, Barry has an article in Survival, which just came out, where he says, Europe can defend itself. Well, Hugo and I have a response in which we say, Europe cannot defend itself. And we really hit the C4SR point very strongly. And the International Security article, we make that point even more strongly. So here's the point, is that the difficulty of Europe being strategically autonomous is exponentially higher in this era as compared to all of human history until, like 1980. The same reasons that the Soviet Union couldn't keep up with the United States at the end of the Cold War. It was just too hard. The US was doing too much stuff. The US was investing in all these different kinds of new capabilities that were really difficult to develop and really difficult to figure out how to use. The same reason is the same reason why I don't think Europe can be strategically autonomous. You guys are unfortunate in that you want to be strategically autonomous in an era in which being strategically autonomous is way harder, takes way longer, is way more expensive than it was ever before. You're just unlucky. And we're unlucky too in the US, in that we would love for you to be strategically autonomous from my perspective. I just don't see it as feasible.
Okay, thanks, Stefan. This debate can go on and will go on, but I would like to go to another very interesting question about one of my students, Wannes Verstraeten, and it's about China. What about China, he asked. The US is making a pivot to Asia, but what does the US expect from Europe in this region? Can you try to elaborate, Stefan? And then maybe Sven afterwards.
I know it's getting a lot of attention, right now. What is Europe going to do vis-a China? What is the United States going to do? And is there going to be some grand battle between the US and China? And does Europe have to take sides? I get all of that. And I guess what I would say is, from the European perspective, like if I were in your shoes, I would channel the kind of perspective that I was outlining at the end of the talk, which would be to ask, what are things that you would like to do vis-a-vis China that you think if you did those things, the US would be like, wow, I'm really glad you're doing those things. What are areas of overlap, and propose them. Don't wait for the US to be like, we want you to do this on China. Come back and say, I think China's a threat too. Like, let me retract that. Like, I don't like that China steals my technology either. I don't like that China subsidizes its firms in ways which undercut, European market share, not only in China, but throughout the world. Those are unfair practices. And it was fine for China to do those things when it was a weak, developing country. But come on, like, even though it wants to call itself a developing country, it isn't one. And the whole idea is, you got a free pass on the intellectual property front when you were really poor, but you're not. And so you can't keep stealing stuff, and you can't keep artificially subsidizing your producers. You have to do, play by the rules that everyone else does. Does Europe really disagree with that? You may disagree about the mechanism by which you get China to change those practices, but you surely agree with that. And so I would listen to what Biden and Jake Sullivan are saying, in that they're like, we think that the problem with the Trump administration, lots of problems. So the key problem was that the Trump administration took a unilateral approach, that it said, here's the approach that we're going to take to deal with China. And we didn't coordinate that with the EU or with Japan or with Canada or with Korea. The West, if you want to call it that, or the kind of the alliance structure that the US and is part of, is roughly 70% of world GDP. If you could get 70% of world GDP saying to China, you have to do this, you have to protect intellectual property, you can't subsidize these industries in this way, you could get China to change. But the US at 25% of world GDP, it can't do that by itself. Europe, it's used to be 35% of world GDP. Now it's more like 23%. A few years it'll be like 20. It can't do that by itself. And so I really disagree with, the approach that you guys are taking on the, recent investment treaty, not so much because of its terms, but because you can't change China by yourself. Only the United States and Europe and Japan and Korea working together can they change China. And so the immediate thing should be, what are the things that we all agree on that we want China to do? Do those things. It's not everything that needs to be done, but that's a lot of it. And then when those things are done and China's changed, then you guys can disagree about, do you want them to do this? Do you want them to do that? Focus on the commonality. No one can go it by themselves. And the weird thing is that the Trump administration was stupid to go by itself on China from 2016 to 2020. And I think, again, use undiplomatic language, Europe is being stupid to try and go by itself vis-a-vis China in 2021. Mistake. Got to work with the United States on this.
Clear. Thanks, Stefan. Sven, I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks. I mean, as a starting point, and I think I agree with your basic trust, Stephen, to say where we agree we should act collectively. Although the question is, can you go very far if you disagree about the overall purpose? I think the Trump administration seemed to say that we'll be satisfied when China basically gives up foreign policy and abandons any idea of being a great power, and that's of course not going to happen. You cannot wish China away. That just leads to a rivalry without end. You could all talk about the evil of communism and so on and so forth. Whereas if the objective is to say, look, our preference is to accommodate China into the world order, but of course that means that China has to live up to the basic rules of the system, and let's collectively try to pressurize it into doing that, then I think we have a common agenda. What I think sadly is also not possible is to say, let's together try to force China to change its domestic politics, reprehensible though in many ways they may be, but it's just not going to work, right? I mean, throughout the whole Cold War, we kept hammering the Soviet Union for disrespecting human rights. They didn't change one bit because that's their domestic politics, that's their vital interest. You have no leverage. So we have to continue to say it, that they should not violate human rights, but in the full knowledge that it's not going to change. Finally, on the comprehensive agreement on investment, the timing, I think, is certainly not ideal, also not for the Chinese. I keep saying to the Chinese that they were very stupid, if you want, in dilly-dallying so long. If they had been smart, they would have rushed it and made some serious concessions. But I think there was a certain arrogance on the Chinese side that thought that, the Europeans will take any deal, or the Europeans don't count. And so in the end, I mean, had we had this agreement sort of in the middle of the Trump term, then from the Beijing point of view, you could have said, now I've sort of driven a little wedge between Washington and Brussels. Now, of course, it's too late. The agreement was announced after the election, and everybody in Europe is just looking forward to work with the Biden administration. It is maybe a bit unfortunate from the EU vis-a-vis the United States, but at the same time saying, look, this agreement, we've been negotiating it for 7 years, right? These negotiations were open when Obama was the president. So frankly, I don't see why now we should have asked authorization to sign it only because the US was changing president. I think in a way, the fact that we were able to conclude the deal with China puts the EU in a better position now to have precisely this conversation with US. Now, what will be our common geoeconomic policy about China, assuming that US will change its geoeconomic policy. And we now have something that say, look, maybe this work. It's not the greatest agreement on substance. And I think what we have to do now mostly is focus on its implementation. I think Europe has to be very firm and say to the Chinese, look, if you're not now going to implement this, if you're not going to respect it, then there will be consequences, economic consequences on our side. That's what I would plead for. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sven. There's a question about the United Kingdom. DJ Oudenaard said, are we discussing EU or the European countries? The remaining EU countries within NATO only weigh about 25% GDP. Where would you see the UK when the Biden administration would talk to or through the EU? Can the EU represent all EU member states in NATO? So the place of the UK in this whole story of European defense. Sven, maybe first, and then Stefan.
Look, I would not hesitate to describe myself as an Anglophile, even though recent British governments have done their best to dissuade me. But one has to be realistic about this. The thing will be settled between Brussels and Washington, and the UK will have to live with that settlement, right? We're not going to first say how does the UK, where would the UK like to fit, and then we'll construct everything around that. That's just not how it's going to go. Because at the global level, if you combine all dimensions of power, you have to talk with the EU. I would say the core of power politics these days is geoeconomics. That is EU, and the UK simply does not have the scale to have much impact on this on its own. I mean, if you go to Asia, to be pretty blunt, nobody cares what individual European countries think about anything. They are just easy topics, easy subjects for bullying and blackmailing. So if we'll have a global impact, then it will be through the EU. If it's also possible that even then, if we don't play it smart, we don't have any global impact. That's just the reality, I think.
Okay, thanks, Sven. I've been told that we should end at 3:30 sharp, so only a couple of minutes left. Stefan, do you want to react on the UK?
Well, one small, not small, but important point to note about the UK is that to the extent that military type security coordination, especially vis-a-vis Russia, to the extent that that shifted over to be done vis-a-vis the EU, then the fact that the UK is not in the EU anymore is a big problem, because the UK was, the most significant military player in the alliance in many respects, in terms of the kinds of capabilities that I was saying before, that these are really hard to develop. The UK had a lot of that kind of capacity. And so if you've lost the UK, it's not obviously lost NATO. If you coordinate through NATO, the response to Russia, then the UK is still part of it. If you coordinate vis-a-vis the EU, how to deal with Russia, the UK is not. And that 25%, I'd say, rough loss in European military capacity by not having the UK in there is a really big hit. So I think that it, somewhat undercuts the argument that a lot of the military planning stuff should be done vis-a-vis EU instead of NATO. Although I understand exactly what Sven says. He was trying to say, no, let's have conventional deterrence, that kind of stuff be done with vis-a-vis NATO, and all the other stuff be done over here in the EU. To the extent that those things can be separated, then that seems to work fine. But my guess is it's not so easy to separate those things. So in particular, with respect to, Sven said, do the conventional military stuff in NATO, but then do cyber and hybrid stuff vis-a-vis the EU. Like, can you really separate hybrid for something the EU should deal with and not NATO? I mean, the hybrid issue in terms of how Russia would do this is, you know, it's essentially a substitute for and/or complement to the conventional military threat. So you would have to be able to effectively deal with the hybrid issue from within NATO. And so it becomes complicated, I think. So bottom line is Europe's complicated. I mean, you have a lot of moving parts and some people are here and some people are there. And that's kind of one of the main points, if not the main point that Hugo and I make in the article, which is that, you know, some European countries want to go this way. Some want to go this way. Some want to go this way. Some want to go this way. If you all want to go the exact same way, and if building up military capacity was as easy as it was in 1950, then you guys would be golden and you could be strategically autonomous. But that combination, the fact that, you know, different European countries want to go in different directions and that it's really, really, really hard to build up military capacity, that makes strategic autonomy really hard to do and I think unlikely.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan. We have to end here. Thank you very much for your presentation, both presentations and the Q&A, very interesting. I hope that everybody has enjoyed it. I just want to remind you of our second webinar that will focus on US alliances in Asia this time, and that will be held in a couple of months. You will be notified either by UXIA or by Egmont or both. And I would say see you then as well. And thank you again, Stefan and Sven, for the wonderful presentations. And
thank you. I really enjoyed it. I wish I was there, but this was very fun and interesting and useful. So thank you for organizing it.
Okay.
Thank you, Stephen. Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.